doesn't look any different. Oh, that's something. Okay, so it's recognizing the device, but left and right are the things that are not working.
So he's gonna walk around just one of us. The page down on the next.
Yeah, I think so. I touched it, that's why. Yeah, just the presenters can't drive it. That's the only problem. So maybe queue this up for fixing, but for the next session.
Yeah.
Thanks for trying.
Thank you.
That's it. If I'm going to do it, it has to be much closer. Ow. Well, hopefully it's just a twisted back, not kidney issues.
Oh, what? Kidney?
Yeah, like a kidney stone or something like that. It's a jabbing pain right in that spot. It would be my first, but it runs in the family, so. Mostly I'm going to blame the beds. You know, these beds are almost as hard as sleeping on the ground. You know, if I was intending to sleep on the ground, you know, for camping, I would have brought myself a ridge roll and, you know, had something to fold out. Yeah, I have a real comfy one for, you know, for the easy camping, you know, for backpack camping. About the level of comfort I'm getting from the bed up here.
So what's the difference on Greg? Is he coming here first and going to Rick after, or vice versa?
I'm really confused.
Okay.
Best I understand, they're
Same for me.
They seem to be keeping him not the first slot, but not really last. Check and see if I've got any last second mail.
Do we put the one in the booth?
I usually put our names both the jerseys. See, no extra emails.
You guys don't make it much easier. You're almost at the farthest room.
The way he's breathing, how you came straight from the gym?
No, I was just running from one room here. I'll have to do it again during the session.
So, Greg, help us understand. As best I understand the what Jeffrey said, you'll be presenting sort of mid session for them. Okay.
Yeah. So again, that's what we thought for everybody.
No, we do have batteries right here. Does it take the double A's that are here?
No, it's a AAA.
Of course.
Those are for the microphones.
How many does it require? I only have one.
Do you have another one of these? But if it's it's all set up, you can, once you have it, look at the book, so it's like before.
Yeah, this is fine.
And I try really hard to show up a few minutes at a time, make sure it's all loaded. So yeah, we can drive it through the buttons if we have to.
Okay. This is why.
Sorry.
No, it's
So the next
just
one.
nothing to do.
Instead, hoping it's just back issues. We have a choice of either just getting started and interrupt when they show up again, or
Are we tight for the schedule, or?
we're not super tight.
Yeah, so just.
Hey, there's a green light. It's got to be something on the laptop. Yep. When I push the button that's lower left-hand side, it did something, so it doesn't be being recognized. Another one.
It's fine. I think we'll just use the. No, it's okay. It's fine.
If we have a little bit more time, we'll reboot. Actually, let's reboot it between sessions and see what happens.
Thank you.
Shall we get started?
Yeah.
Good morning. Let's get started. This is BFD for IETF 104. As usual, here's the note well. You are expected to have read this at some point. You are bound by it either way. So we have a relatively short number of items on the agenda. Some of these things may go slightly faster than is on the schedule. So working group status. BFD multi-point documents have hit the RFC editor. So this is a long piece of work that is finally wrapping up. At this point, we're just really waiting for a couple of authors to finish acknowledging things. The Daves are somewhat notoriously hard to reach for these sorts of things. The BFD Yang model is in misref mode. And what that means is that it's waiting on two other documents to pop out and proceed so that they can get published. These two documents are the IETF MPLS base Yang model and the TEAS Yang model. If you happen to work in either of these working groups, MPLS or TEAS, please feel free to try to help them get that document set done, and they'll help our documents move along as well. The BFD for VXLAN is in AD evaluation state, so this means that Martin will hopefully be doing his job and moving it along sometime soon. So the authentication drafts are an interesting state. The authors have worked to take care of all of the addressable comments. At this point, there are no open addressable issues in there. One of the interesting pieces from that is part of last call, we received very minimal comments on them. We really need a little bit of extra review from the working group for the working group to want to move it forward. one of the comments that did come up at the last minute was that there is IPR to disclose, but Hesh actually pointed that out very early into the last call process, and the Sienna lawyers moved a little late on that, so the IPR didn't come out ahead of time. At this point, the IPR that is listed on the drafts basically shows that it's using the IETF required reasonable and non-discriminatory licensing. However, it does not have any language on there that covers the licensing fees. This has occasionally been a concern for the working group, especially since BFD technologies are sort of plumbing and tend to get implemented in things like open source software. So we're sort of stuck in a how do we proceed on this? Minimally, though, the group can move the documents forward as one possible option. Another option that I think that Greg is about to talk about, I'll let him speak.
Yeah. Greg Mirsky, ZT. Yes, and as was discussed, that I am concerned with the licensing terms. I understand it's unfortunate, but it's beyond our control. What I propose, working group, to take a brief time, hold on this document. Might be lawyers will come around to their senses. But in the meantime, think about technical solution that is alternative. Again, we're not discussing IPR. We're not discussing how applicable it is. Everyone can draw their opinion individually, and based on that opinion, try to propose alternative solutions.
So, a couple of disclaimers. I'm not a lawyer, and I don't understand or claim to understand these IPR statements as a lawyer would. What I wanted to, the other thing I just wanted to point out is I'm, of course, no longer with the company, Sienna, so my ability to influence the lawyers is limited to my access to the Sienna as the people that I worked with. And I just wanted to kind of find out that I did approach them to see if they would be willing to kind of relax the terms on the IPR. The general tone of the response that I got was that according to them, the IPR terms are pretty much in the range of other IPRs that have been declared against BFT. And in that sense, it's not too out of the ballpark in terms of the now, specifically in terms of the license, and I'll read it out. The email said that, first of all, IPR statements do not require or imply that a license fee is due. It specifically states that any license should be sought may be with or without a fee. So it's definitely that statement is there. And they have pointed to two other, at least IPRs within BFT, which in the terms are probably even more constrained than Sienna's IPR.
Okay, Greg Mirsky, again, same ZT. I understand your situation. I've been in this situation, and on some drafts, I'm still in this situation. And I made peace with that. Because, yes, unfortunately, I cannot change people's mind for many reasons. If we can talk about, I can really point to which wording, what type of wording is more acceptable at IETF, and it's called as covenant. And if they agree to that, I think that would resolve this issue completely. So what they are saying, oh yeah, well, it's only possibility. It's understood, but it's still possibility. So the other version is very clear, and that is what being practiced by most of the companies. And I have to say that some companies do listen to input from IETF people who work at IETF, and they understand and they follow on the advice. So some people don't, some companies don't, and that's an unfortunate fact. So beyond our control.
So possible steps forward. So Greg, if you have specific language that you can share to the mailing list, I think one more step we'll try before we look for ways to work around the IPR or just simply do the call that the working group actually wants to proceed with the IPR as stands, is to have the chairs contact the Siena lawyers and share our concerns with them and see, based on those concerns, whether they're willing to adjust things. New working group documents since IETF 03, 103, we've had BFD large packets get adopted. A new version of that has been posted and will be covered today. The BFD unsolicited draft also got adopted and has gotten some changes as well, and we'll be covering the changes for today as well. So 5884 biz, the consensus of the working group is that we do need to actually do this. The amount of work on it is relatively small. There's just enough things that are there necessary to close off some technical issues. At this point, the existing implementers understand how to appropriately do stuff. It's just a matter of actually writing it down. This work had originally been deferred just simply because we were trying to finish a bunch of documents up and wanted to keep the working group focused. We may be looking at picking this up as part of the next cycle.
Okay, Greg Mirsky, clarifying question. Original authors, they will help as editors, or they will help as reviewers?
Both. So Creedy has volunteered to actually drive the text. He's one of the original authors of the text.
Okay, great.
Another piece of stuff from the mailing list was Greg's draft, Drasmirsky, BFD, MPLS demand. There was a lot of discussion on the mailing list. We had done a working group adoption poll. Somewhat in fairness, Rashad and I as chairs did not do our job and do our initial review before we actually did the adoption call. The discussion that we largely converged on in the mailing list is roughly two things. The first one is that the demand mode procedures largely are clear in the base BFD RFC. The thing that is potentially a little ambiguous is whether the diag code would be considered a parameter change, for purposes of the poll sequence. In terms of logically how BFD has to behave, that's exactly what we're looking at. We've actually asked Dave Katz and Dave Ward, the original authors, to help clarify that that was their intent. Assuming that that actually falls through for this specific piece, we'll actually just simply file an errata on it, and if we ever do a biz on 5880, that will get picked up. The remaining item in there from your draft, as best we understood reading through it, and the list discussion, is the upstream in this case is permitted to set a diag code that causes the downstream to take an action. We do have already in the base 5880 the cat-dated circuit case that is a place where a return code from an upstream can cause the downstream to take action. So at least procedure-wise, we have a direct analogy to what's going on. What I think is perhaps the single lingering detail out of the draft as you originally published is a very clear procedure for this specific case of if you detect something upstream, set it to this exact diag code, the downstream should then take a specific action on it. So the interesting headache we have here is that in terms of clarifications, we have exactly one very small piece of procedure that probably is about a paragraph's worth of note. That is something that we could continue to do a draft for. It's also small enough and close enough to the analogous case that potentially another errata could also be covered in that. This is certainly open for discussion, and I think that not only in terms of BFD working group and Greg's input, this may be something that takes specifically as a sub-work item, just for clarification and opinion, specifically to the MPLS group that's applied to.
Yeah. I don't think that, again, in my understanding of errata is not to clarify thing, but correct thing. So this draft, if anything, clarifies and makes things definite or definitive. Okay? Mm-hmm. So it's not correcting. So it's not that something is wrong. Yes, something might be considered to be ambiguous, but that's not the purpose of errata, to clarify what's ambiguous.
So we have plenty of historical precedent, especially for BGP, across the errata stream there. That's partially what my opinion is based off of.
Well, yes, but in my personal opinion, some errata that I submitted, I was told, oh, well, this clarifies behavior, so this is not errata material if you want to write another draft. Again, probably we all have different experiences with how errata being applied, accepted, and treated. So it's not ambiguity. So I still think that the process described in this document is sufficiently different from what can be drawn from pieces of 5880. So there is value in working with it, and I ask working group to consider adopting it so we can work together with the working group.
I'd like to know if anybody in the room has read the draft or has any opinions, because up to now it's been the Greg, Jeff, and Rashad show, and we'd like to hear. And sometimes, Greg also has asked if our opinion were as chairs or as contributors, and I've tried to stay in this as a contributor and not as a chair, but it'd be good if we hear from other people. One difficulty also I realize is, as far as I know, and please correct me if I'm wrong, there's none or very few implementations of demand mode out there, or when I was actively developing in BFD, there was none. Maybe there are a few now.
And I think that was noted in our discussion, is that multi-point BFD is demand mode. Yes. So, and we know of at least one or two implementations, and actually, if we think about it, this procedure described has very interesting impact on P2MP BFD. So I don't want to go into details to use time, but I just wanted to point that, yes, there are implementations of demand mode, but not point-to-point.
Yeah. So where I think we're at on these points, try to drum up a little bit more readership on the mailing list. Let's get some additional viewpoints as to whether people came to the same conclusions as we did. If it makes you happy, we can ask ISG, in terms of clarification of whether they think errata is appropriate. And I think it's the chair's opinions for the parameter change piece. That is absolutely the case. In terms of the procedure, that one I think is a little more ambiguous whether errata is actually the appropriate thing. So let's proceed that way. Okay, so here's a list of drafts to watch elsewhere. I think the ones that are mostly on the new side of things is the BFD for beer. And we also have the BFD for LS for SBFD for PGP LS is seems to be making progress, so that one's worth paying attention to in IDR. And we're now to our first presentation, which is BFD large packets. Albert could not be here today. I'll go ahead and stand in the box so people can see me. Maybe hit the present mode button. So as I mentioned, Albert could not be here at the last second, so he asked me to present his slides for him. So the draft got adopted and did get a couple of minor changes as part of the adoption. Just to reiterate the problem statement, especially for WAN circuits, often due to issues, the provisioning side of things, large packets of some form are not able to make it across some subset of links. The problem that tends to happen is protocols don't notice this because they simply don't use max MTU packets, and therefore you may end up dropping some packets but not others. This is very difficult to diagnose, especially when you're doing some sort of ECMP that they have some of the traffic safely able to get through but not others. And throughout this whole thing, interface and protocol status are going to show as alive, because in most cases the keep alive packets are too small. And we'll get to at least one case where other protocols solve this problem differently. And the problem here is that there are no network alarms that actually tell you that this condition is happening. In some cases, especially for network services that are provided over routed infrastructure, you may go from having a path that's completely clean for a specific MTU to one that stops being clean. And this leads to a huge amount of troubleshooting, and sometimes applications just start failing in very random fashions. Next slide, please. So the proposal here is really leveraging what the authors of BFD left as an intentional ambiguity in the spec. The BFD packet headers cover the size of the BFD packet. It doesn't pay any attention to the encapsulating protocol at all. So one option that we have, especially with example UDP encapsulation for 5882, is that we just simply stick some a padding at the end of the packet. And this is sort of similar to other mechanisms. So we think about the evolution of the OSPF protocol back in the day. They stuck on authentication basically as a bit of stuff at the end of the packet, and that was their way of getting extensions. And to some extent, that was also a kept in the back pocket mechanism for doing things to BFD that the original authors had left there, and for the most part had not talked about over the years, simply because they wanted to keep BFD a simple thing. This is an example of this is still relatively simple. We'll get to later presentations from Greg that actually covers potentially other things that we could do with this. The example here is if you look at the bottom, the Internet Core may have the standard 1500 style Ethernet max payload. The padding size gets adjusted to basically cover the contents of the BFD packet. Obviously, if you're doing things like BFD authentication, you'll need to change that value as well. Next slide. So a new variable is added to BFD to track this stuff, and it is enabled on per interface basis and potentially all the way down to a per session basis as well. This is strictly at the IP layer. We're not actually changing BFD at all. More importantly, and this is one of the things that we had to talk about from concerns on the mailing list, there's no need for the padded size to be exactly the link MTU. So example, jumbo frame 9K packets are very common in many people's cores. This is not something that you necessarily care about if all you care about is end-to-end for a given protocol that you're MTU like 1512 clean. For the most part, this type of problem tends to be observed mostly on commercial WAN links. This occasionally is observed in other places. Data centers, it's somewhat unusual. Usually in data centers, you tend to have L2 connectivity issues rather than MTU issues. But certainly this can be used in other environments as necessary. Next slide. Somewhat by analogy, ISIS actually has a TLV that allows for padding somewhat for this exact scenario. So the question sort of became, as part of this discussion, why don't we solve this potentially in other layers, other protocols? As an example, OSPF and BGP don't support this. BGP being a little bit tricky, since it's a TCP, no speaker, you'd have to actually extend TCP to do this sort of thing rather than the BGP protocol. OSPF could have a mechanism very similar to ISIS. Whether that makes sense or not is potentially discussion for the LSR working group. Part of the problem is, even if we did extend these additional mechanisms, for purposes of deciding whether the link is usable or not for a type of traffic, you're still looking for detection times that are acceptable to those underlying applications. In a lot of cases, people are buying minimally very large megabit circuits, if not gigabit circuits, and a couple seconds worth of downtime for an unacceptable application is actually a big deal. And once we look at the analogies for existing protocols like OSPF, BGP, you end up in large numbers of seconds downtime for those protocols to decide that things are not working correctly. BFD on modern implementations generally are control plane independent. They run on the line cards, and these things tend to scale up very nicely. So BFD does have a lot of nice properties where this seems like an appropriate place to put this sort of thing. We've received a commentary that perhaps some other L2 or other OEM environments might be more appropriate for this. The problem is IETF really doesn't have a generic OEM working group, nor do we cover specific layers. Certainly IEEE can pick up such work, but as we sort of discovered through things like BFD on lag, operators are looking to try to solve these problems, ideally more in the IP house sometimes than the IEEE house. Next slide, please. So where I think the draft is right now is that we had some busy discussion as part of the early adoption. The contents are mostly not controversial. A lot of this comes down to, I think, in many cases, whether you believe BFD is the right place for this or not. I don't think that there's going to be necessarily a lot of technical changes over the course of development for this. Trying to convince my employer to actually pick up a prototype for this. And Albert, I think, is actually looking at hacking some BFD implementations in Linux to see if he can actually get similar behavior. So at this point, we're looking for technical discussion and comment, and hopefully we'll be able to proceed to implementation in the last call relatively soon. Questions and comments? Do we need more caffeine? Okay, thank you. Okay, our next presentation is on BFD unsolicited. Rashad is taking that one up for the authors.
Hi, yeah, I'm going to be presenting the changes in BFD unsolicited. Next slide, please. So this was presented in Montreal by Anke and Naming. There's been two sets of changes. The first set of changes has been mostly formatting related to going to XML format. And the most significant change is that we've added the Yang model for configuration and operational data for the BFD unsolicited. Next slide, please. So this Yang model for unsolicited, it augments the modules which are in the BFD Yang, which Jeff was referring to initially, which is in MISREF right now. There's a new unsolicited container for configuration, which allows to configure parameters for unsolicited OK sessions. So just as a reminder, the reasoning, the motivation for the unsolicited feature is for cases like static routes, where currently most implementations have to configure BFD on both sides, even though you have the static route really from just one peer. So that unsolicited container has the parameters for the unsolicited BFD OK sessions. There's a leaf right now which we've named allow. I believe we should rename that to enable. Now the config container can be at the top level or per interface, and that's feature-based. There's two Yang features have been defined. One is parameters global and parameters per interface. And on the operational side, there is a new unsolicited container per single hop session, which gives you the unsolicited state per BFD session. It's basically the role, whether it's active or passive. Next, please. And this is the boring Yang tree. As you can see, it augments the, this one is the top level container I was referring to. It's got the BFD parameters and the allow leaf, which we'll probably rename to enable. And it depends on the global feature. Next slide. And this is exactly the same thing, but per interface. Next slide. And here's the operational model change. More comments on the work. I think there were quite a few comments in Montreal since then. I think there hasn't been any. So please take a look at the draft, especially at the very exciting Yang model change, which was recently added. Any questions? Thank you.
AC Linda, I just think this is that last is a good function for simplifying use of BFD in places where you use it automatically. I mean, you could come up with some kind of API or something, but it's a lot of complexity. And if you just have this, it makes things a lot easier, and obviates some of the people that suggest seamless BFD is the answer to those situations, which it is not. This is for many of them.
Yeah, for most of these cases where seamless actually makes sense, those tend to be especially more things like segment routing is an example. Yep, BFD for Geneva is next. Did we not get the current version of the slides?
That's fine.
Oh, you mean the order is wrong. Sorry.
Hello, everyone. I'm Xiaomi from ZTE. I'm going to present the draft shell BFD Geneva. This is a 0.0 version draft. Next slide. Firstly, intention of this draft, it specifies the use of BFD in Geneva overlay networks. This draft is similar to draft IETF BFD VXLAN, which is in ISG processing now. The major difference between Geneva and the VXLAN is that Geneva supports multiple protocol payload and variable length option length. Length option, sorry. Okay, this is the Geneva encapsulation. You can see Geneva header is at the same position as VXLAN header. Geneva header includes 2 bits version, 1 bit, 6 bits option length, 1 bit indicator of control message, 1 bit indicator of critical option, 16 bits protocol type that follows the ether type, and 24 bits virtual network identifier. And then variable length options in TOV format. So that's the Geneva header format. As I know, in MVO3 working group, Geneva is the only one overlay encapsulation working group draft in standards track. Geneva can be used to handle not only Ethernet frames, but also IP packets, MPLS packets, etc. but VXLAN can be only used to handle Ethernet frames. Next slide. This is the first scenario. When Geneva payload is Ethernet frames, IP packets, or MPLS packets, the IP UDP BFD encapsulation can be used. So here you can see below the Geneva header, IP UDP BFD encapsulation is reused as the RFC 5881. This slide. Okay, this is the second scenario. In this scenario, Geneva payload is neither Ethernet frames, nor IP packets or MPLS packets. So in this scenario, a new Geneva protocol type need to be requested to indicate the BFD control message. So here we have a question: do we really need this encapsulation? Because I'm not sure on the requirement for BFD to monitor the Geneva tunnel of non-IP service. So I'm not sure we need this encapsulation. So it's for discussion. Next slide. This is the unified scenario. As I know, in NVO3 working group, it's still in discussion whether we need a new Geneva OEM shim. So if we have a Geneva OEM shim, we can use this shim to indicate BFD control message. So this is a unified scenario, cover the previous two scenarios. Next slide. Okay, next steps, ask for more review and revise this draft, then ask for working group adoption. Question, comments?
So Matthew Bocci, just speaking as NVO3 chair, you may want to actually post a question to the NVO3 list about whether or not you need a non-IP encapsulation, because probably the users of Geneva would have some input to that.
So you mean we need to use IP UDP?
Whether you had a question in your slides about whether you need a non-IP UDP encapsulation, it's like a RAW encapsulation in Geneva, and given that the Geneva is being standardized in the NVO3 working group, and the users of Geneva are mostly in the NVO3 working group, it might be useful to also discuss that on the NVO3 list, and maybe we can bring it up in the NVO3 meeting tomorrow just to make the working group aware of this draft in BFD.
So you propose we to present this in NVO3?
Yes, or maybe at least put a question to the NVO3 list saying, hey, look, we've got this draft on BFD over Geneva, which we've brought to the BFD working group. Could you have a look at it and send us your comments? And we have a question about whether this particular mode is needed.
Yeah, so what Matthew is saying, I think, is that question you ask here, I believe what you're saying is the BFD work group is not the best place and NVO3 work group is a better place. I mean, it's good to ask the question here, but please ask that same question in the NVO3 working group.
And a request to you, Matthew, is that when we're doing the review for the BFD for VXLAN, we asked questions and got mostly no answer. So if you could, within your own working group, help push review for this, that would be great.
Yeah, I'll add probably on the status update tomorrow. I'll point to this.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so if time permits, I can present this in NVO3 working group.
Sure, if you ask. Yeah, I think we've got time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any further questions?
So I haven't been following Geneva. You had a comment there about the shim header. What's the, I mean, is that something which is being decided right now, or is that?
As I know, it's not decided right now, but it's still in discussion. Because
Okay.
my co-author, Greg, is working on the Geneva OEM shim, I think.
Thank you.
Sure, you're up.
Hello, my name is Mersha Zheng from Cisco. I'm going to present BGP BFD street mode. Next slide. The problem statement. IFC 5882 enables routers to monitor data plane connectivity and detect the forwarding path failure. And BGP protocol leverages this specification to enhance the faster convergency. Today, BGP protocol neighbor session establishment is independent from the BFD state. Because of that, there are possible failure scenarios when BGP interaction with BFD. The scenario A, a BGP session may be established while BFD session is still down. Okay. The scenario B, a degraded or poor quality link may result in the corresponding BFD session going up and down frequently while BGP session is established. For eBGP case, typically eBGP peer is a multi-hop away, and those kind of scenarios are likely to be observed. The consequence of the impact would be traffic being black-holed, routing queue, and networking interruptions. So next slide, please. The proposed solution, BGP BFD street mode. This proposed draft defines BGP street mode operation as preventing BGP session establishment until both the local and its remote speakers have a stable BFD session. And we also defined BGP BFD capability for the BGP protocol signaling peer on the BFD information. Next slide, please. This is the definition of the new BGP BFD capability. The type is TBD. The length is 1 octet, and the capability value contains of 1 octet BFD flags. The BFD flags contains bit flags related to the BFD. The most significant bit, MBS, is defined as a state of street mode. We also call the B S bit. Next slide, please. Operations of a street mode are a BGP speaker with BFD street mode enabled must advertise the BGP BFD capability with S bit value set to 1. A BGP speaker which supports BGP BFD capability advertisement must examine the BGP capability, BGP BFD capability received from its peer. Only if both the local BGP speaker and its remote BGP peer have a BGP BFD has BFD street mode enabled, then BGP session establishment will be prevented until its BFD session is up. Or we said only both peer are street mode enabled, then the BFD street mode constraint can be applied. Okay. If either peer has not advertised BGP BFD capability with street mode enabled, then a BGP session should not be required prior to the BGP session establishment. Next slide, please. So the conclusion, we have identified a problem with BGP and BFD interaction, which could result in the routing queue and networking interruptions. We propose a solution to the problem refers as a BGP BFD street mode that prevents BGP session establishment until BGP session is up and stabilized. It enables BGP speakers to signal its peer additional BGP extensions using optional parameter BGP BFD capability. Following the proposed strict mode of operations, we avoid situations which result in the routing tree and network interruptions. The next step will be, I think if you review the draft, please ignore we are going to revise the backward capability session and based on the RFC 5492. And another one is we are also going to working on the more detail on the BFD session state transition for the next version.
Bill Hallibury, Infinera. So the idea is good, and that's why I have been doing on my implementation strict by default and lenient only if configured. But I don't see why you need capability at all. BGP sessions are configured at both ends, so you could just have a configuration option whether you want strict or not, and that's what I have implemented and has been deployed on field and works quite nicely, and that also avoids the unnecessary first establishment of BGP, then noting that it's strict and tearing it down.
So I actually have a counter to that, which is not so much that I think that the capability itself may be required. We have seen between Juniper and Cisco routers as an example for the hold down mode. And once you drop the session, what do you do before you bring the session back up? That we end up in deadlock scenarios because the idea of who brings up things at what time, do you actually insist BFD come up before you even bring up your TCP session, or do you do it only after you have transitioned your session to some portion of up? Clarifying this is definitely of value no matter what. Whether we need the capability for it's a different question.
Yes, so defining exactly at what point BFD session is brought up would be great value, and my personal view is that BFD gets up if it's configured and just delays the start events.
Keyur Patelarkas, I think you can do this particular feature without using a capability itself and by default fall into the strict mode. The draft in itself is pretty good and should be progressed. I think capability is debatable.
AC Lindum. The reason we want a capability is there are some circumstances under which you might not want to run strict mode, and there are some that you may. So that's the reason. Now, what we were thinking, I mean, this is going to be more when into the implementation. We just hold the state in open confirm mode until the BFT session was established, and we'll think about that some more, but that's where we're leaning as far as putting in the draft.
Right, and he's right here.
Keyur Patel Arcus, that is exactly what we do at Arcus also. We hold it up in open confirm mode if we don't want to fall back to a strict mode, but by default we are in a strict mode.
Right, this is very much a BGP state machine issue because Juniper's implementation actually holds off even opening up the TCP session. So this is why you have the deadlock. This is definitely worth clarifying because we do have actual operational issues. I don't recall, was this presented in IDR? I don't think so.
Not yet, not till tomorrow. AC Lindum again. I was just going to say that our existing implementation does not bring up the TCP session, the one we have right now. And one of them, yeah, one of ours.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
That's the key thing we have to introduce this signal. Yeah.
Any further questions? Okay, so in terms of comments and next steps, these issues about when BFD is used to bootstrap an application or vice versa has proven itself to be an interop issue. This is absolutely a problem that needs to be solved. I am definitely supportive of the draft moving forward. Since this is really a change to BGP procedures, my suspicion is that the proper working group that needs to own this, and this is just half an opinion of the chairs, this may belong in IDR to progress. It is BFD's charter to help review these things in other working groups as well. So the chairs of IDR and BFD will discuss where this might belong.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Les Ginsberg. So, Jeff, I'm not worried, but I find your statement a little bit odd since the changes are all in the BGP protocol.
Yep.
It would seem very odd to me to have this work done in BFD.
That's a question we continually get bounced back to us. MPLS is a big example of sometimes the MPLS chairs are happy to punt things over to BFD to own, and they own the review step. And it just really becomes a conversation among the chairs. So, but I agree,
Yeah.
IDR is the natural place for this.
I trust you, but I just thought I'd make that comment.
Hi, Ketan Talaurikar, Cisco. So it's exactly the same problem, and we're looking to address it in OSPF. So I would not really go over all the details necessarily, but yeah, we can go to the next slide, please. So the problem statement is exactly similar, and even in the OSPF protocol, there is no way of knowing whether the peer supports BFD or not, and whether it has this capability to operate in the strict mode. And this is what we are trying to achieve, which is not bring up the OSPF adjacency until we have a successful BFD session established between them. The problems to be solved is exactly the same. You can skip to the next one. So the proposal, this is for both OSPF V2 and V3. It's exactly the same mechanism. So we want to enable, introduce this ability to indicate that there's a desire to monitor, and that the OSPF adjacency is not going to be, brought up until the BFD session is up. And this enables the OSPF neighbors on link to, learn that my neighbor is going to operate in this mode. So that's what this thing. I want to clarify that there is a ISIS spec, RFC 6213, which has similar extensions for ISIS. Next. So how is it done? This is the protocol machinery or the proposal in OSPF. We have hello messages, and they carry a link local signaling block. So there are this, we are called extended, we have a TLB there, which is extended option and flags field. We're just looking at introducing a B bit there. And this is so to indicate actually the BFD strict mode. We did not want to have a BS bit, so it's just a B bit. And this is because the desire is to bring up in strict mode. So as soon as the neighbor detects the hello message with this B flag set, it's an indication, a new neighbor is learned, it's an indication that we need to bring it up. And the change is really in the OSPF neighbor FSM, and there's text in the draft which clarifies that, that the FSM be held in the init state, and that the router does not include the neighbor address in its hello message until the BFD session is up. So it's really these details that we're trying to specify, so that it's exactly, I mean, this is what would help achieve interop, because we know there are multiple implementations out there which already do something like this. And then after BFD comes up, the neighbor state machine progresses to, two-way XStart and so on. Yes, Greg?
Yes. Excuse me, Greg Mirsky, ZT. So I understand their idea, and it's a practical. You want to bootstrap BFD session from OSPF. Then you still depend how fast your BFD session will come up. It still depends how your timers are configured. So I don't know, if you already advertise this B in OSPF, so desire to have BFD session, maybe there is a value of adding their timers, BFD timers, in so that the other side knows about it, and then your BFD session can come up faster. Because if your endpoints are configured differently, right? If they're not using for the, or if, for example, you have different implementations and their default values are different for the timers.
Is this the BFD detection timer we're talking about? Or
Transmission receive timers that may end up in a multiple POE exchanges. So if you want, again, it's something that you might consider to optimize your BFD session coming up. So to minimize number of POE messages being exchanged, you advertise them in OSPF and saying, okay, if he advertises, if this node advertises it wants a BFD session and it advertises the timers and we can accommodate it, that's what we start with. So then your BFD session will come faster rather than going back and forth in exchanging BFD POE messages. It's just an idea, okay?
Okay, I mean, I haven't thought about it, but yeah, sure.
So, Les Ginsberg, Greg, based upon a number of years of deployment experience with this in ISIS, I don't see any need for what you're suggesting.
Okay. Okay, now next slide, please. Then we have some backward compatibility aspects, and that's the reason for actually signaling this as well, so that this mode of operation is invoked, or we go down this path only if the two routers are both indicating this capability, and if not, then it just follows the existing OSPF FSM. And the change is only in the initial adjacency bring up part. It's not really in rest of the OSPF neighbor FSM or interactions with BFD or the BFD protocol itself. And BFD bringing down the session and all of that continues as is today.
So it's a question for you and for BGP also. So what happens if your peer did not advertise strict mode, you don't have a BFD session, you are up? I mean, I saw that in the draft, I don't know the answer. And then the peer starts to advertise strict mode while you're already in established or upstate.
So I've added text in the draft to clarify that, and the answer is that it would not result in any change in the routing adjacency. So if it's already up and after that you enable or disable this mode and all of that, we do not want to disturb an existing routing adjacency. So it's the idea is to only use it to when it's coming up, and if it flaps again, goes down, the next time it comes up, it would go with the string.
Marsha from Cisco. To answer your question from BGP side, that's also the same. We tried to make sure not to disturb existing BGP session establishment until both sides enable the strict mode. Otherwise, we'll make sure BGP session can be established.
So again, based on the use of this in ISIS, I strongly suggest you have some language to handle transitions, because particularly if you didn't use BFD when you first brought up the neighbor, and then you want to enable it, you'd like to be able to transition into that hitlessly, and then make sure that if you have, going forward. So
we have some text.
All right, I
would appreciate your review.
I should review. Yes.
Next slide. So this is just to cover the BFD interactions. I mean, this is what we just spoke about. I had that in the next slide. Next steps. So this mechanism or this thing is implemented by multiple vendors, at least we're aware of few. And this is done with explicit configuration, as was mentioned earlier. It's explicitly configured at both ends. But we have seen some challenges with interop issues sometimes because it's not exactly specified in which neighbor FSM to hold it and how to go about it. And this is what we are trying to address and clarify here. So we would be presenting this in LSR working group later today and look to get feedback. And we're planning to progress this in LSR working group. Of course, leave it to the chairs to work out.
That is exactly the same comments. LSR is likely the appropriate place for this. If the LSR chairs care to punt this back to BFD to own, that's totally fine. BFD is there to help review no matter what.
Actually, that's a question to you and Les. Okay, since your experience. In your experience, have you seen a need to do taking down BFD session from OSPF? So then the other side knows that the session will be going down.
So one of the common things, and it's actually been an interesting interop problem occasionally, admin down is a common way to transition BFD sessions into I'm deconfiguring it, but should not impact adjacencies. And we've seen implementations, including bugs of my own, that did the wrong thing. But that's exactly what admin downs for.
So in this draft, we have put some text to indicate that admin down should not bring down the OSPF session. Obviously, we'll wait for...
should not bring down OSPF adjacency.
Yes. It doesn't, it's common for both. Yeah.
Okay, so if that's acceptable, then it's fine. I just thought that if you want to bring up BFD session initiated from OSPF, maybe you want to use OSPF to indicate that it will be going down, don't bother, don't get nervous.
So again, and I think you've made this point, we're not changing once the OSPF neighborship is up and the BFD session is up.
Yeah.
We're not changing what happens when the BFD session goes down. Admin down, we ignore admin down. If it's not admin down, so
we bring, exactly that. But just for completeness, there is some text which talks about this case as well.
Sure.
More explicit.
AC Lindemann, response to Greg, at least for OSPF, we have two mechanisms for indicating a peer is going away.
Yeah.
We have the goodbye hello, which is which you just take the guy out at two-way, and now we have a more graceful mechanism where you make the adjacency the less desirable using
link over
a link attribute. Yes, a link attribute. So I don't think we want to rely on a third mechanism to say we're going down. I'd like to, well, the three of us talk about this whole thing a little bit. We'll do that. Yeah.
So I have a question, maybe not to you, maybe to the people who've been around a bit longer. I mean, I remember, why am I looking at you, Les? Because I remember actually my... Well, I actually remember the first time I got to know Les was because of the IA. Les was working on ISIS. I was working on BFD. That was about 15 years ago. Now, what's changed for SPF? And okay, I mean, we've had lots of issues. Sometimes same vendor, different implementations, different vendors. Why suddenly? I mean, I'm really happy this work is being done, but why suddenly the OSPF and BGP work now after 15 years? I mean, you don't. I mean, you don't have to answer. I don't want to put you up on the spot.
I can answer. Even I have less gray hair. I can still. So we have seen a lot more deployments, and especially in some parts of the world, we are seeing a lot more lossy, degraded links now, which and all other stuff going on, which is making this more and more popular. And we have had this config option, and we were able to work with it. But we are also getting into more of interop amongst multi-vendors. So it's been there for a long time, but I would say some recent experiences, triggered this thing.
So we're having a lot of fun here, but the comment I would make is I think this is actually long overdue. It was always, and I know there are multiple vendors who have implemented this functionality, based purely on configuration, but given that it actually changes the operation of the protocol and affects interoperability, it has always been very strange to me that we would decide to do that and not update the protocol itself. So to me, this is just something it's long overdue.
Yeah, Marsha from Cisco. I actually want to say the same thing. And when I read the IFC 5882, it has the section 4.1 specifically talking about the control protocol establishment. It also described the scenario similar to this one. And so until today, we provide this solution for the client side. And we actually also have a customer encountered the problem exactly and the request to have this fixed. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Next presentation is with Greg. I think you're broken.
Okay, so again, this is called extended BFD. Well, some might think about it as BFD 2.0. We'll see where it goes. Next slide, please. So what the motivation? Well, we all discussed many interesting scenarios, how to use BFD beyond their path monitoring. And it was a quality of BFD session because, well, in a link that is unstable, lossy, and with their default detect multiplier of 3, it might be a situation that we lose every other BFD packet. So we're getting very close on the edge of failing, but definitely it's not good enough. So it might be not performance monitoring, but it's something really very maybe serve as a very good indication that things are dangerously close to falling off the cliff. Or it can be, might be there was a proposal to use BFD for the performance monitoring and path MTU, either monitor consistency of path MTU or do path MTU discovery of sorts. And when we thought about it, so what it should do is that clearly was that backward compatibility is the first requirement. And ability to extend beyond what we thought of, so everybody who has an interesting idea scenario would be able to extend this mechanism. So which means like TLV, it's very simple, right? Use TLV and it will be extensible. Next slide, please. And what we are proposing is just take BFD control message as defined 5880, guard word we think that might serve as, if you come up with a weird combination of bits in 4-octet word that is unusually to pop up in a random space, that will be indication whether it's a really extended BFD or something else. Because again, face it, we are still using the same UDP port number. And then followed by TLVs that can use enclosed TLVs as a sub-TLVs, and those may use, again, enclosed TLVs as a sub-TLVs. Next slide, please. So it all starts with a capability negotiation. And that's where the backward compatibility kicks in. The proposal is that length field in the BFD control message as defined by 5880 is reflective of BFD control message length. And for IP encapsulation, for now, we're only considering IP encapsulation, not MPLS encapsulation. And IP total length in IP header reflects the length of IP header, UDP header, and extended BFD message. So when the initiator that initiates the capability negotiation in extended BFD sends its first extended BFD packet with announced capabilities, well, it expects something back. What can be coming back to it? If nothing comes back as the timer expired, well, then it should realize that extended BFD is not supported and go along with the 5880. If it receives back anything different from the final, with some capabilities acknowledged of the peer, well, then everything is fine. They can proceed with extended BFD session. But if it receives something different from the final, like a POL packet, then it has still to conclude that extended BFD is not supported and go with the 5880 version of BFD. Next slide. So after that, what can be done? Performance measurement. I apologize, there is a typo, it was mentioned, but it should be 6374 RFC, loss and delay measurement in MPLS network. So the proposal is that we use the messages for loss, delay measurement, and loss and delay measurement as defined in 6374. And we only put type and length on top of them. So it allows us to do direct mode measurement. So thus, we have packets that are defined in profile for given flow. And BFD is used only to collect counters on these in profile messages. Or BFD, extended BFD with the loss measurement can be used as a inferred or synthetic mode. So it can be used to generate a certain packet. If we want to variate length of extended BFD packet, there is an extra padding TLV. It can do delay measurement, and timestamp can be collected either in truncated PTP 2 1588 format, or in NTP format. And each side, sender and reflector, they can support their own format, and they explicitly indicate it in the packet. And again, it's not something that we introduce, it's already in 6374. And then there is a combined loss delay measurement mode that is again supported by message defined in 6374. Measurements can be done either one-way performance measurement, for example, as using extended BFD message as control messages sent in asynchronous mode periodically. And it not necessarily will be every message. Again, it could be some nth message in the flow. Or it could be measurement using the POL sequence. So that performance measurement is done only with the using POL or flag. And then message, it's echo request reply mode. The message to the remote goes with the POL. Its counters or timestamps filled in by the remote and sent back with the final bit set. Okay, next. So this just recapture of what's defined in 6374 and how it looks for the extended BFD. Loss measurement, we can go really fast. So this is delay measurement, and again, it has indication of the timestamp format of the query and responder, QTF and RTF. Next slide. And that's with the combination of loss delay measurement format. And for varying the length, if we are doing synthetic measurement or delay measurement, there is extra padding TLV, and the same can be used for MTU. And again, MTU can be either monitored using pulse sequence, or it can be used along with their periodic messages sent in asynchronous mode. And then what you can end up with that if MTU suddenly changes, then the session will go down because messages may not get through. So again, it's varying from the detection to monitoring. Okay, so we will add, continue working. There's some outstanding things that to be worked on. One of them, for example, is fetching results from their one-way measurement. At the same time, I believe that it will have to have Yang model, so this metrics can be exported, not necessarily fetched. Then, of course, discuss, and we welcome comment, suggestion, and cooperation.
Thank you, Greg. If you could stay up there for a minute. So the chairs took a moment to prepare a couple of quick slides.
Before we go there, I have a question.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what you're proposing here can be done by other means today. You're just proposing to do it faster. Is that or is that things which there's no mechanisms? I mean, WAMP does those things you just described, right?
Okay, what means faster? First,
well, by faster, I mean because you're proposing to do something within BFD. That's what I mean. But because typically BFD runs at faster rates. So my understanding.
Again, as I pointed out, it not necessarily always has to work with their asynchronous mode. And again, it doesn't have to always be for each message being periodically sent in asynchronous mode. So it can be used in pulse sequence. So, and pulse sequence can be any frequency. Okay, so again, there is a flexibility. For example, if we talk about MTU, right? So you can use MTU detection.
Yeah, we have the same discussion for
yes,
the large packets.
Right, or you can use it as MTU monitoring, because for the pulse sequence, you can only monitor. You send it there. Yes, packet might not get, but you will get a clue that packet didn't get there, right? Okay, because it times out. Yeah. And then your sender can interpret the result whatever it wants. Okay, so it's more like a monitoring mode. Okay. Yeah, so again, I think that what this introduces this flexibility of doing it in message and doing in a polling mode, not necessarily doing it only in periodic fashion. And that's a flexibility that I believe that we can appreciate and use, because sometimes in a different scenario, we want the session to go down, but in some, just notification, the realization that something changed is good enough.
Okay, so basically, the question I was getting at, which was the same question we asked for BFD large packets, is why do that in BFD? We had that discussion. ISIS has it, others don't have it. BFD is the placeholder. So from what you're saying, okay. So my thing was, why do that in BFD? So from what you, my understanding,
I understand.
You want BFD to go down if there's losses.
I can explain what has triggered this work as a last drop, because definitely it was something that was in the back of mind, and we discussed it, and somewhere deep it was growing. But the last was a discussion on mechanism Rift has for zero-touch provisioning and exchanging link IDs that can be interpreted as BFD discriminator. So there is a provision, and actually there are a lot of interest in zero-touch provisioning, right? And they realize that they need to bring up BFD as they bring up boxes. So if they bring up BFD already, why not to extend BFD that along with bringing BFD, they will get more powerful OEM toolset rather than just path monitoring. So basically, the motivation for this to extending BFD is to give to zero-touch provisioning model powerful and comprehensive OEM toolset.
So I'd ask you to pause for a second there. Like I said, we prepared a couple of quick slides, and part of this is prior discussion, and this is summarizing some prior points. So the question really comes at one. We've had discussions over literally about 3 years, and certainly the motivations for like the DFT performance work was an excellent example of at what point do we decide that we need to change the core of BFD, and part of that is can we do it in the existing protocol, and really the criteria the chairs have had over the entire life of the protocol is that BFD was always intended to be a very thin protocol, very fast, very easy to implement, very easy to implement at speed. And to some extent, that means that one of the criteria we've always used is what do you want to do as a new extension every 3 milliseconds? Because that's the aggressive timers that people try to go for. So when we look at some of these applications, part of the interesting question becomes, you're giving examples of doing this work as whole sequence type of information as a way to sort of not do the work all the time. That's certainly a mechanism to try to do less work, and that's an interesting discussion point. The other criteria that we've tended to use is the extensions can't break our core use case. The poll is an example of how we might be able to use that as an extension and not break things. And basically, where we have been driven in a lot of cases is when the extensions don't look like they fit into the core use case very well, we've had to say no. So in terms of methods, certainly, as the example, when BFD large packets sort of let out the door, something that we've known that we could use for years as a possible extension mechanism, your mechanism makes sense. We now have a place that we're willing to advertise that we could do this sort of thing to offer at least a level of contrast. The large packets really isn't doing much with the contents beyond the end of the packet, whereas some of the stuff you're discussing would potentially impact like BFD state machinery. So there may be some motivations to not do it with simply V1. The gotcha is that, the other problem is that anything we put past the end of the packet won't work with the existing authentication mechanisms. So that's going to be a red flag for our security guys. Please.
Actually, we specifically refer to BFD control message defined by 5880 as defined by 5880, whether it's with authentication extension or not.
Right.
Okay, so basically, yes, we don't change if BFD 5880 or BFD regular classic. Okay, I don't know how to refer it. Let's agree to call it classic. Session is configured with authentication. Everything stays the same as authentication.
Right, and the comment really is that the authentication really covers only contents of the BFD packet rather than the stuff that come after the end. Sort of by contrast, and again, BFD's large packet stuff was partially motivated by same trick that OSPF used years ago for its extension. And it's no surprise, Dave Katz was an old IGP guy. He knew exactly that trick was there. In their case, they added authentication as the thing after the fact, so that didn't have to change the existing PDU behaviors. In this case, the authentication is already part of it. So one of the things we have to discuss as part of this process is what this does to authentication. Second thing is, as an example, poll sequence work based on the contents is an example where it's sort of a state machine type change. Pay attention to some things or not. again, it's larger discussion. At some point, we have to decide when the procedural changes are finally a motivator to do a BFD v2. And, this is an excellent starting point for the conversation. Problem, of course, is it's larger work. The extensions, and the sort of premise of large packets is that you can stick things at the end and have existing BFD v1 just work fairly seamlessly with it. So that's a nice thing.
Yeah, actually, we definitely took a clue. I appreciate basically the impulse that was given to us by the large packet work and discussion. But what we wanted to introduce this negotiation to make clear whether it can go with extended session or has to go back, basically as a safeguard, because otherwise, there is no point, because the communication can go only one way and the session would not proceed if one side insists to using extended and the other side is only supports.
Right, and we do have bits for BFD v2, so the motivation has to become whether the backward compatibility considerations for existing deployments really justify having the behavior in v1 versus a v2. So again, longer conversation. This is not to draw conclusions. This is just to highlight things we knew about. The last one for my list, again, the question usually becomes, what do you want to do every 3 milliseconds of BFD? So we give the example in your pull sequence version of being able to do work that's covered by OWAMP as an example. Whether or not the guys from OWAMP would actually want the stuff that happened in BFD is an interesting long question. Mm-hmm. But the sort of meta point that comes from this is less about what the applications actually are. It's partially what the comments that we've had from the ASIC implementers over the years for BFD. They like BFD, similar to the guys who like IPFix and NetFlow, because it's fixed size, very easy to parse, very low work to actually do. The minute we start introducing TLVs, we introduce into basically the core fast paths of the CPUs the need to actually look at variable data. Guys that work on IPv6 ASICs will tell us that they're not very happy with how that stuff works. So again, this is another piece of our discussion.
Yeah, I appreciate the chairs taking time to read it and comment on it before the meeting. One of the motivation for us to use 6374 is that it's already very much like fixed size, and where your timestamp and counters is, because we can define how it's used, and then given their fixed size or predictable size of BFD classical control message, it's in a well-known place. Yes, I absolutely agree. For the performance measurement, your fields that you fill in, timestamp and counters, they have to be in a fixed position. And because I think that, yes, might be in a discussion, we'll come with more normative and strict language defining how it should be used. Because we might agree that, some things should not be used in asynchronous mode.
And just to interject a point before AC that follows on that, TLVs themselves are not necessarily bad when used in such a way that you can actually understand they're there. Again, picking on NetFlow and IPFix as examples, those are template-driven systems where, by describing the template ahead of time, fast lookup mechanisms can be implemented. You're not doing completely arbitrary TLVs. Yep. What you're actually doing is a fast template processing.
Okay, let's give AC chance to.
Okay, AC Linda, I haven't thought about it as much as the chairs. I just really looked at it earlier before the meeting. So the one thing I was going to say about OSPF, we do have separate authentication for the LLS. It did come after, and we did have to put a separate authentication in it, and it is a much more control plane-ish protocol. If you go with this completely generalized, capability-based, TLV-based, I think they should be separate protocols. Leave VFD one alone, if that's the way you choose to. If you just do some little, okay, this is how you do this, with some simple extensions, then maybe you could do extend BFD1. But there's a lot of, I'm thinking back to those easy chip based line cards. I mean, they'd never do anything more.
Yeah.
No, it was not easy. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Again, why we emphasize.
Greg, you know that, don't you?
I know that.
Yeah, that's right. I remember you were around too.
Yeah, I have my bruises and scars. One of the reasons why we emphasize use of pulse sequence, because the pulse sequence always go to control plane. And actually, okay.
Most of the time.
Okay. I'll tone it down most of the time. And then actually impact on asynchronous mode will be lesser, but at the same time it can still be useful for the same performance monitoring, because you don't really, if we look at the protocols like TWAMP, or now we have STAMP, so the reflector, it doesn't matter. If your clocks are synchronized and everything it doesn't matter how your reflector processes the received packet and sends it back. Whether it's all hardware, is a bump in the wire, or it's a control plane. Because if you collect for timestamps, then you exclude the reflector processing time. And if your clocks are synchronized, then you can measure not only round trip time, but you can reliably and accurately measure one way. Okay, so pulse sequence, and that's why I said we might agree on excluding certain operations in connection with the asynchronous mode, right? But we'll explain then that requires certain other conditions to exist to produce useful performance metrics, for example. Okay, so again, just extending poll mode with this mechanism might be found useful and worth pursuing.
Keyur Patel, Arcus. I just have a quick comment. Aside from working with hardware implementations and having an unfortunate experience of implementing this protocol in software, one of the things I really appreciate about it is the fixed packet formats and actually fix field lengths within it to really read the packets pretty fast, having static buffers defined. So if you come up with a variable length TLB format and variable length packet size, my only suggestion is have a cap such that a priori and implementers would know if you have to implement this somewhat in software.
Yeah, if we can go back. So again, the use of TLV, at least for these scenarios, is only necessary for extra padding, because everything else, and again, that's why we reuse what's defined in 6374. Because again, to my liking, as much as I'm exposed to performance monitoring, 6374 structured it perfectly. Again, we can say it's very similar to CFM. Okay, so it's not a bad example. Okay.
So to maybe move this conversation one further step to the extreme, just because part of your motivation was trying to supply some needs that Rift may have.
I would extend it more generically, zero-touch provisioning paradigm.
But one way to read, at least between part of those lines, is IETF has been somewhat in need of a more generalized OAM mechanism for a while. A question for the working group over the long term is the BFDV2 work potentially motivation to try to actually leverage doing new work on the protocol for some more generic OAM purposes? I don't have a strong opinion on this.
Yeah. And again, I've been exposed to 6374 and IP protocols like OWAMP, TWAMP, and now we're cleared the working group RUSTCO on a stamp. I appreciate their discipline of 6374. And it's more hardware friendly than TWAMP or WAMP. Okay, so it's just, again, as Asim pointed out, yes, I know the problems of chips and not to overextend it, so and make it position well known and predictable. I think that 6374 is very good tool for the performance monitoring.
Any further comments in this discussion? Okay, so again, this is a big piece of work. You're motivating, good discussion for what we do with BFD next. We'll continue taking this to the mailing list for the time being. So this will conclude the BFD session. You're encouraged to show up at LSR and IDR to comment on the proposals for BFD strict mode in each of those working groups. Please provide them good feedback, and we'll take any further actions also to the mailing list.
Yeah, just on this last topic on Greg's presentation, please, everybody, whether you deploy or implement software, hardware, BFD, that's a pretty big topic if we take this on, whether it's in the way Greg presented it or whether we do V2, which has a big impact, as Greg mentioned. So please be vocal, but nice. Thank you.
It's okay.
See everybody next time. I think I'm going to look up how to go to the hospital. It's hitting my 8 on my pain scale.
Do you have any thoughts on whether we'll have a meeting?
So the stuff that we have in the queue right now, the first half of the presentations are things that I think could progress in the mailing list on their own. The BFD strict mode stuff, I think, will progress in the individual working groups. So the main reason to have a discussion, I think, is primarily this.
And might be just to reflect of what might change with the optimizer application.
Potentially, but where it sort of comes down to is, ideally, we'll get some good discussion on the DFD, whether it's V1 extended or V2. If we have nice, aggressive stuff on the mailing list and we're not necessarily converging, that's an excellent use of microphone time. So the session basically becomes let's discuss this, even a working session. The alternative is that we come to radical consensus very quickly, and who needs a session that way?
So it's still open.
It's still open, It's
it's possible.
It's absolutely possible.
Okay. Yeah.
And especially, I don't know, people have different. Montreal is convenient, I think, for many people, maybe not the time. Some people take holidays and a lot of the time and don't show up for the summer one, but in terms of location, it's convenient. So
yeah,
it's, we've been trying to meet every 2. I'd be perfectly okay meeting in Montreal and not meeting in Singapore. I know, Jeff, the Asia trips,
it's a little bit trickier for me.
A little bit trickier for you, so I'd be fine if we meet in Montreal.
Okay,
and
just
not in
to
Singapore.
understand plans and
In general, and